What session are we? Is this session? Where are we in the
16.
16?
Well, I'm going to stay as long as okay, I'll hear. Hmm? I did.
Haven't got.
I did 17, 18, 19.
That's 17, 18.
Oh, okay.
Plan on going.
Okay. Are we too far away from you?
Say,
Well, I don't like to be too close to people because of my problem.
I know that.
Huh?
I have a problem too.
Well, that's, yeah. So she's,
That's why she's not a reason she doesn't.
well, that's my problem.
Okay, so. Margaret. Ron.
Yes.
Questions about.
Oh, really? Oh. Well, I'm going to
Testing.
a little bit. Yeah.
Okay, let's begin the simple prayer of Our Father. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay, now I'm continuing on chapter 16, verse 6. By loyalty and faithfulness, iniquity is atoned for, and by fear of the Lord, a man avoids evil. Oh, you need another book there. All right. Yeah, page 34. When a man's ways please the Lord, he makes even his enemies be at peace with him. And this is all with the understanding that we are made for the Lord, not our own particular little egos. Now, dropping down, you see the note there, 16 semicolon 6, 16:6, loyalty and faithfulness. Tangible acts of kindness and mercy towards others performed as acts as penance. One who practices charity draws near to God and becomes more like him, whose loyal and faithful commitment to his people is frequently mentioned in the Bible. Okay, now I'm going to quote here from Matthew chapter 25, starting with verse 37. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you? And the king will answer them, truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of my brethren, you did it to me. The point there is that we are all sons and daughters of God. God created all of us, and therefore we are to be servants to others. Now, service can be in many different ways. Obviously, it's helping out with the poor, but in my occupation, for example, I work at a sewage treatment plant, and there's 40,000 people in the city of Linwood that depend on being able to flush their toilets and anything else that goes down the drain and wastewater. And there are many businesses, restaurants, food services, nursing homes, and Edmonds Community College, too. So that's a service, and Paul does a service in real estate, and Ron, when he was working, probably still does help out people, showing them how to, ski, among other things. So.
Well, and if you can't do anything else.
That's right. As Margaret points out, if you can't do anything, pray for someone. That's usually, when I was involved with St. Vincent de Paul, a lot of people, when we'd help them out with rent or their electricity or water, or bring them food, they would always ask, well, what can we do for you? And I had a little sheet here, this prayer, on pray for us each night, for all St. Vincentians out tonight. Pray for them, and also pray for this church too, because the donations, just you can help out just right out through the door there, the place to donate food, and the poor box for the money. It all comes from the parishioners. So that's one good way of trying to follow in Christ's commandments. Another thing is we are to maintain peace. And one lesson that if you ever do get mad, blame yourself for getting mad. Because if you get mad, you're playing right into the hands of the person, the adversary that's making you mad. And you don't want to give them the upper hand. Always answer with a small, calm answer. And many arguments among husband and wives are solved by saying, what, Paul? 2 words. Yes, dear. Yes, or I'm sorry. And, will you forgive me? Yes. I always throw that in, even when I maybe make a stupid mistake at work and somebody charges in on me and yells at me, and I usually ask, well, all right, I was wrong. Will you please forgive me? And, we all make mistakes. Okay. Verse number 9 here. A man's mind plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. Now, many times in my life, I've had miraculous things happen to me. And all I can say is that the Lord held me along. I don't think I ever would have gotten through college if the Lord hadn't really helped me. On a couple occasions, it was totally inexplicable. In one case, there was a major test coming up, and I was just shocked. I just felt that I was going to fail this thing because I was in a class with a lot of other people that were repeating the class. And I had wandered down to Shory's bookstore, and there was this old organic chemistry book for sale for $5. That's all I had was $5. So I bought it, put it in my attaché case, fell asleep, and then woke up in the morning and went to the class. And the instructor said, this is an open book final. Now, the textbook that you have probably won't help you out that much, but here it is. And so there was the test, and I reached in there and opened up this old book that I had bought, and all the answers were written in the margins, matching what was on the test. The next day, as I was walking to another class, the professor from that organic chemistry class he was at least 70 years of age at the time, comes running down. He says, Duke, I want to shake your hand because you're the first person in 30 years that has ever gotten a perfect paper. And I said, I just owe it all to the Lord, truly. Some people will say that's coincidence. I don't believe in coincidence myself.
I think it was the Lord too.
Yeah, verse 16. I keep that book. I still have it. It's a treasure. To get wisdom is better than gold. To get understanding is to be chosen rather than silver. And we'll get this into another scripture, but they're really talking about the refining of gold and silver. It's just like when we go through life and make a lot of mistakes, we're getting like silver and gold purified, where that dross, the impurities are wiped away, and hopefully we're maintaining that path toward heaven. Verse 18, pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. It is better to be of a lowly spirit with the poor than divide the spoil with the proud. He who gives heed to the word will prosper, and happy is he who trusts in the Lord. Now down at the bottom, or again, 16 : pride before a fall. The person who is arrogant, overconfident, or inflated with superimportance is destined for humiliation. For God opposes the proud. On the other hand, Proverbs teaches that humility goes before honor. And I think we've all known people that speak too much and are trying to, impress us with a lot of words, and trying to be the smartest person in the classroom. A lot of times it's best to just move on, stay away from those people, because you don't want to. Yes, go ahead.
I think Donald Trump would, if he had just a stroke of humility, would be a great president.
Well, you can say that about a lot of those politicians. I personally don't watch the television or even the internet. I don't watch the news. So, because it's what they call it, the destruction of, or the act of personal destruction all the time, where somebody is going after somebody else. And a lot of times, to me, very important issues and policies are kind of swept aside in this personal attack all the time in politics that I find disheartening to see. I know when I was a youngster, television was just coming in. I used to, before that there was the thing called radio that I listened to. And at the time when television was coming in the late 40s and early 50s, we were all promised that the intelligent level of the American public was going to go way up. And you're going to get the best of the operas, the best, Shakespeare plays, and all the great culture, all the great symphonies, and on and on and on it goes. And it really didn't happen. I know with my father, we went to a neighbor who had just the first television in the neighborhood, and the first thing on was Liberace. And I could hear my dad just yell out in the back, because he was right by the back door. It was very crammed in that room with all the neighbors. And he said, God, this is just even worse than radio. And he left. And right then I knew that we were never going to get a television set. He was a very smart man. We're going to get into that too a little bit later in chapter 17 about the downfall of television. But moving on to 24, pleasant words are like a honeycomb and sweetness to the soul and health to the poor. So if you can maintain positive thoughts and try to stay away from naysayers and people that are complaining all the time, it's good not only for your soul but for your body as well, to maintain good spirits in your soul and with others. So there's a lot for just laying all your problems at the foot of the altar and letting the Lord straighten things out. Chapter 17. Better is a dry morsel with quiet than a house full of feasting with strife. Okay, this goes to the fact that bringing back television, prior to television, I know that we gathered at the table at dinner time and prayed and discussed, any problems we had. We were always grilled by our parents how well we were doing in school or not. And there was a kind of a unity that was developed in the family meal. Well, television comes in and people are watching television while they're eating TV dinners, and that unity, I think, collapsed. And also, even children, you can't do homework and watch television at the same time. It grabs too much of your attention. And I know with my wife, now she's a lot younger than I am, she grew up watching television and trying to do homework at the same time. Now, she's not any more brilliant or dumber than I am, but I didn't have television to mess me up while I was doing my homework. So even though when I went to school later on, people were discussing Perry Mason, I had no idea what they were talking about. He was a trial lawyer, Raymond Burr. And, but, I didn't bother me. That gave me also another lesson in life that sometimes it's better to be silent and be thought stupid rather than open up your mouth and remove all doubt. So, there's some things like murder mysteries and all that you don't need to know. Okay, in verse 16:32, he who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city. And in the note down here, slow to anger, the wise know how to control their temper and exercise the virtue of meekness. Taking cities is a lesser victory than controlling anger because these places are outside of us. The greater victory is achieved by patience, for then a person conquers and subdues himself, enabling him to bear with others in humility. In other words, control your temper. If you get mad, that's a problem with you, and try to overcome that. Again, you don't want to fall into the trap of, somebody yelling at you and you yelling back. It never solves any problems. And, okay, turning the page to verse 3 on page 36. The crucible is for silver and the furnace is for gold, and the Lord tries hearts. And this is kind of the illusion, again, that you're being purified in life by having to deal with a lot of nonsense, things that your misfortune comes your way, whether it's some sickness or some misadventure. In my case, once for some unknown reason, I had to go up to the Shorecrest High School and pay $1,000 because one of my sons had destroyed a computer. So you never know what's going to happen. I paid it. I didn't even ask. He was so upset. I didn't. All right, I'm not even going to ask what happened. But things happen in life, And yes, yeah.
Oh, I said they do happen.
Yes, they do happen. You never know. Some people. Maybe there's a child that's disabled or something, and you wonder why, and you kind of have to take care of them for many, many years. Things you never know what's going to happen. An evildoer listens to wicked lips, and a liar gives heed to mischievous tongue. And that's kind of illustrating that. An evildoer wants to basically lure you in and control you by lies. Politicians do this all the time. They're always, saying something like, "Oh, if you elect so and so, they're going to do away with Social Security, or do away with Medicare, or whatever it is." And the other person obviously is probably not going to do that. They'd be thrown out of office if they did, or they wouldn't even get elected if they did. So there's a lot of loose lips and wicked lies and things like that, and playing out gossip. And you want to stay away from that. I don't like to hear bad things about anybody. It doesn't. It's not going to help me out any. It's not going to help anybody out, really, other than the evildoer. Number 5, he who mocks the poor insults his maker. He who is glad at calamity will not go unpunished. Now, again, that point about he who mocks the poor insults the maker. We drop down to verse, I'm going to do 3 and 5 here. The Lord tries hearts. He tests the genuineness of our faith in the fires of adversity. Comparing this to the smelting of metals also suggests that suffering can only purify our hearts of selfishness and misplaced priorities. And then dropping down to 17:5 insults his maker. Callous disdain for the needy is an offense against God, whose image is borne by every person he has made, whether rich or poor. This proverb is similar to the one in 14:31, only here the sin is defined not as oppression, but as rejoicing in another's misfortune. By contrast, kindness to the poor is honored by the Lord. And at this time of year, again, you're all encouraged to, there's various ways to donate and help the poor in the church.
And if we need
The answer was from Paul. The answer is to follow the way of Teresa of Calcutta. What I was once upon a time, anyway, it was Kolkata. Not Calcutta, but Kolkata. Anyway, that's something else again. We often mispronounce other countries. Even Turkey now wants to be called Turkiye. And they're adamant about it, so that's fine. I guess we've been mispronouncing that country, just like, when I was younger, we called the capital of China Peking, and should have been Beijing. Capital of India should be oh, what is it? It used to be Bombay, and now it is not the capital, the major city there.
Yeah, well,
Yeah. Anyway, it's changed too. So.
yes, yeah. It was-
Oh yes, different names. Yes, depending on your language. Yeah. Right. Yes. Right. Okay. Right. Yeah. Even as Ron is pointing out, the name what we call a VW bug is different. You know, the Germans have different. Well, they named it. Why we call it a Volkswagen, I don't know. But that's the way of it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Folks was, there were also folks,
Right.
ordinary people.
Yeah. People wagon.
It was very unexpected. Two of them.
Okay. Now, dropping down, I'm going to go from verse 8 down to 16 because they're talking about bribery. Verse 8, a bribe is like a magic stone in the eyes of him who gives it. In other words, an evil person, it feels that, all right, by this bribe, I'm going to get something back in return. And sometimes it works. A lot of times it works in this country, unfortunately, where bribery gets votes in politics or other, and other ways too in business at times. But unfortunately, that's the worldly way. Unfortunately, that bribery does work at times
Money speaks.
because people are willing to accept that bribe. And down to 13, if a man returns evil for good, evil will not depart from his house. The beginning of strife is like letting out water, so quit before the quarrel breaks out. So in other words, if a man returns evil for good, in other words, taking that bribe, because that's what they want you to do. That person wants you to take that bribe and get used to you accepting gifts. And that way you will basically be in his control. But you need to get away from the evildoers who only, want what is really in their evil interest. And you don't want to get involved in anything like that. Okay, let's see. Number 20. A man of crooked mind does not prosper, and one with a perverse tongue falls into calamity. In other words, you should always be giving honor to God, not somebody else who is just. God is the just person, not this person, a man of crooked mind, who does not prosper. In other words, he's not going to be able to help you at all get to the road to get to heaven. And that's why you have to choose your friends closely. Number 27, he who restrains his words has knowledge, and he who has a cool spirit is a man of understanding. Going down to the footnotes here, 17:27 restrains his words. Guarded speech is recommended as a virtue of wisdom. cool spirit, one who is patient and slow to anger. And then continuing on 28, even a fool who keeps silent is considered wise. When he closes his lips, he is deemed intelligent. And that's true, because people will criticize you for what you say, unfortunately. Well, sometimes they'll make up things, but it's best not to go into areas that you know nothing about. Where I work, occasionally I work with a lot of younger people than I myself. Sometimes I'm old enough to be their grandfather, but they're going to be talking about things like cryptocurrencies and fantasy football and things that I know nothing about, and so I remain silent. And I don't get involved in either one of those things. That way I'm above the fray. You know, I don't participate in fantasy football because I know I'd fall flat on my face and wind up in last place, and they would ridicule me because they ridicule each other. You know, if person A beats person B, not only does A kind of criticize B, but C and D do the same thing. You know, so it's all they say it's all in good fun, but there are people. Yeah, okay, whatever it is, it's anyway. Some people will probably take it to heart. You should never think on how your words can affect somebody else, especially if they're harsh or cutting. There's that old phrase, sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And I don't believe that, because they do. So, moving into chapter 18, verse 10 and 11 here. The name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous man turns into it and is safe. A rich man's wealth is his strong city, and like a high wall protecting him. Now, the explanation down below, 18:10 to 11. A contrast is implied in the juxtaposition of these two verses. The Lord is a fortress of protection for those who call upon his name in prayer and worship. Wealth, however, provides only a temporary and unstable wall of defense for those who are blessed with much. The value of riches is thus subordinated to a relationship with God. So always put God first in everything you do. I usually use the example with my children. I says, your mother should always place love of God above myself. Because if she does it the other way around, and I can be rather snippy at times and come up with sharp little answers to things. And I know my wife is very tender on those things and doesn't like to be criticized. And if that's the case, if she puts me above God, she's really going to have a very low opinion of God. So she needs to always maintain that high view of God and love of God, and she has to put that over myself and even her children. Because God is much more perfect and loving and caring than I ever will be, unfortunately. Okay, number 17. He who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him. And that's, we're going to read the note here, but basically, always look at both sides of the story. 18:17, until the other. A practical observation about the importance of listening to both sides of a story. Many times somebody will get to you first and give not only their story, but a kind of a colored version of the events. And you need to hear the other side before making any judgment. If, in a lot of cases, I would just recommend just listening to what people have to say, and don't get involved. Because you don't want to get involved in somebody else's fight, that if you can avoid it. 22, he who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord. And you can say the same thing about a wife finding a good husband. 22, finds a wife. The goodness of marriage is affirmed as a gift from God. A husband is called to cherish his bride and to recognize the Lord's blessing in a good and prudent wife. On a theological level, the value of finding a wife is comparable to the benefit of finding wisdom. As one's companion for life in both cases, one obtains favor from the Lord. Now, you notice that they use the word that prudent. And I'll tell you, in the many years that I was involved with St. Vincent de Paul, whenever there was strife between husband and wife, it was always over money. And a lot of times when you ask a family like that, will you just list in percentage-wise, how much do you pay in rent, how much pay in utilities like water, sewer, electric, and the phone bill and so forth, and then entertainment. In fact, one day, I'm not going to mention his name, but you know the name of our priest here. He admitted he went through something like that and discovered that he was spending way too much on entertainment. And that's true of a lot of people, that, again, you need to actually look at where your money is going. You develop a budget and go over. I always tell, especially to young families, to develop a budget and find out where all that money is going and make corrections. Do you really need Netflix? And some of these computer, what is it, the Microsoft Game Box or Xbox or whatever it is, all that type of stuff. Is it really necessary? And of course they'll say yes, but he says no. Look at.
You can say the same about time.
Yes, where you put your time, as Paul points out, that's also very important. Do you want to go into a further explanation on that, Paul? Okay, all right. Well, yeah, you need to spend the time, like going to church, and my wife and I, fortunately, there's a lot of nice music, and there's a lot of different types of rosaries on the internet. I like to go to the scriptural rosaries. You know, that's a kind of an explanation of the mystery between each Hail Mary. And we tend to listen to that and participate along with it. And so, you know, certain types of prayers, like the rosary every night before you go to bed, and your own examination of what you've been doing each day will prepare you for confession. Okay, 19 now. Better is a poor man who walks in his integrity than a man who is perverse in speech and is a fool. So a lot of times, a lot of people will kind of rush into what I would consider unrealistic dreams. You know, they don't really think things through. I'm sure Paul will tell you that if you're going to get into any kind of business of your own, especially, you need to develop a business plan and go through all the quirks and problems that you may run into, and how you're going to deal with all those problems before you just kind of rush on into things. I think a lot of times with a lot of people, they'll go to college and rush into something that is not really going to do them all that good. I run into a lot of people with what we consider, well, I consider, and they eventually consider, useless degrees. It's not going to is not really helping them out. They've got a degree, and well, I'm not going to say, I'm going to list what, but it's tough to find a job when you have a degree in philosophy, for example. Now, it's necessary for a priest and a lot of other, I know when I went to Seattle University, we had philosophy classes to teach simple logic and things like that. And also, we had theology classes too that were very important, I think, in developing the total person. But I majored in chemistry and minored in math, and that helped me out. And but I was an older person at the time. I didn't start college until I was at least 25. I graduated when I was 30. I had a lot of time to think about it. So a lot of times you don't want to rush right into something, because I really didn't have a good idea on what I wanted to do in life. Some people never do. Yes, I did. At one time, I started out with Professor Roble in mechanical engineering, and the guy was absolutely crazy. He used to throw chalk at me, his eraser at me, and unfortunately for him, I'm sure he had, and the way he would grade his paper, it was just, all these stars and all these other, he would mess up, I couldn't even read what I had written down. And so I dropped out of mechanical engineering and went into chemistry. I figured I can't live with this guy for every quarter. Obviously you did, Ron. Congratulations. I thought the guy was absolutely crazy, but no, I never had a chance to sleep in class. I was one of these guys that was always sitting up right up front to pick up anything I could learn, and that helped. I had a Professor Chang, one of my favorite teachers. He taught mathematics, and he graded on attendance and citizenship and participation in the class. Because I know on a final exam, we were supposed to solve this problem, this area under the curve, 5 different ways, and I only got 4. And so theoretically, I should have just gotten a B, but he gave me an A. And I went to him the next quarter and asked him why. He said, well, you show good effort. You attend every day, and you're sitting right up front, right in front of me, and you participate in class. Because in life, that's really what's important. You need to show up for a job, you need to participate, and you need to show good effort. And that is what is important in holding down and getting a good job. Okay, makes perfect sense, All right, now let's see. Yeah, you need to think things through in life, and also what it takes to get through some of the wisdom from Professor Chang there about attendance and paying close attention to what other people are telling you, and participate in a good way. Don't sidetrack the conversation to something else, and show good effort always. I was also in that same class again where I did 4 out of 5. I had in those days it was punch cards. We hadn't gotten to the modern day computing yet, and it was, I don't know, about a half a foot thick, I swear. I turned in, and there were some other people that they just used a few cards. And Professor Chang told me, well, they were cheating. They were using techniques that I hadn't taught. Therefore, I had 3 of you that I gave you A, and 8 people that I gave Fs to. I show no grade inflation. The administration is happy with me. And that's what happens to cheaters, too. Eventually, they're going to get caught, They learn their lesson. Don't ever take a class from Professor Chang, because it's not going to work, people are going to find out about you if you try to do that. Okay, and then, like I say, on the business about a prudent wife, and I've heard this from many other men in my time, that marrying a pretty wife just because she's pretty is not a good way, not a good choice many times. It's a wife that's, again, going to be prudent, that's going to be, and this applies to husbands too. Just because he's so handsome doesn't mean that he's going to be a wonderful husband. He can be. My daughter, for example, always liked to root for whatever team Tom Brady was on because she felt that he was so handsome. Well, I don't know. He might be going on I don't know. He has his problems with his marriage and his children too. So the answer is to marry somebody who's very stable and going to be your companion for life, and one who's going to maintain favor with the Lord. That's really what counts. Okay, verse 5. A false witness will not go unpunished. Well, we just went through that with Professor Chang, And he who utters lies will not escape. Eventually they will be found out, hopefully. Dropping down to number 11. House and wealth are inherited from fathers, but a prudent wife is from the Lord. There we go again. Whatever you get from your parents and your ancestors is one thing, but choosing a wife is very, very important. And a lot of times, like a lot of things, you have to leave the feelings out. I know that sounds bad, but analyze it. Is this the person that you can live with for the rest of your life that's going to help you? This is both ways for wives and husbands. I know when my wife and I were engaged, we had to go to see some lady over by St. Patrick's Church. That's originally where I was baptized. And, of course, now the highway runs through the original St. Patrick's, but, I mean, literally. And this lady, asked us a lot of questions just to find out if we were compatible. And I think they still might do that, some kind of a marriage encounter. And on the other hand, I've known people that failed that the person in charge or the priest in charge felt that these two people were not compatible, that for one reason they were not going to bring up the children in the faith, or they're going to let the child make, they could make up their mind, and all this type of stuff, and which I think is absurd, because how in the world can even a 5-year-old make the decision on whether they're going to be a Lutheran, a Catholic, or a Buddhist, But again, you have to really examine things, and you might have the feelings and love and all that, it's a physical attraction, but that's not going to carry you over the long run, and that's what marriage is all about, is that long run. And so now on number 17, he who is kind to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his deed. In other words, the Lord is going to reward you again if you've helped out, like in Matthew pointed out, the least of my brethren, being kind to the poor. One way of doing that is, like I say, either joining or helping with food, money, or whatever to St. Vincent de Paul, or many others. Next Step organization, for women that need counseling, or even diapers and a lot of other things for infants. It's a very good organization. And then let's see, where are we at here? Yeah, okay, 1917. I'm going to read here. Kind of the poor, by various acts of compassion and practical assistance, typically called almsgiving, the Lord promises to reward our works of mercy, sometimes with temporal blessings, but ultimately with his mercy and the inheritance of eternal life. Concern for the rights and needs of the poor is expressed several times in Proverbs. Also prayer, too. Having, again, spent a lot of time in this parish, a lot of the people that attend St. Mark Church here are not all, extremely wealthy or even middle class. I know several people that attend St. Mark here are people that I had helped with St. Vincent de Paul over the years. And not very often, but every once in a while. And I know from other people that I've discussed, from other faiths, they're just basically, the very well-to-do, or others maybe just middle class. But I don't think there's as many in the lower classes that attend a church like the Catholic Church. We're open to everybody, and a lot of these people also, they'll help out in many different ways. They don't have the money, but they give their time and effort. So number 23, the fear of the Lord leads to life. That fear of the Lord is just always maintaining that God is watching you, and He is merciful, but maintain that sense that God is kind of in control of things. The fear of the Lord, that He is in control of things, and so rest, in try to commit your life to the will of God at all times. And I think we're going to stop right there, and we can have Father Katersky with his insights. Number 6, I believe we're on.
This lecture will consider the book of Psalms, and in particular, some of the wisdom psalms that are very closely related to the pursuit of wisdom that we have been studying. This lecture will consider the book of Psalms, and in particular, some of the wisdom psalms that are very closely related to the pursuit of wisdom that we have been studying from the book of Proverbs. I'll try in this lecture to provide a general orientation to the book of Psalms by considering the various categories of psalms, and then I'll discuss the place of those specific psalms that are designated the wisdom psalms within that classification scheme. I'll also try to discuss some of the distinctive aspects of Hebrew poetry in terms of literary form that is present in many of the psalms. And toward the end, I'd like to offer a couple of suggestions about the use of the Psalms and other parts of the Scriptures in praying for wisdom, which is a very important part of this whole tradition. Let's begin by considering the book of Psalms as the Bible's prayer book. It has long been regarded as the prayer book of the Bible, and so it is central to the prayer of the Jewish people as well as to Christians. It is something that has been used for individual prayer, but also is very frequently used liturgically. In Hebrew, the title of this book is Tehillim, which means hymns of praise. The giving of praise is certainly one of the main purposes of the Psalms, but by no means the only purpose. And psalms of praise are therefore not the only type of psalm. Our English word psalm comes from the Greek name for the instrument, the stringed instrument that was used to accompany the psalms, the psalterion. How many images there are of David, who is the reputed author of these psalm prayers, strumming and singing to his own strumming. To list just the major types of psalms, there are hymns of praise, there are hymns of thanksgiving, there are hymns of lament, both individual lament for personal suffering and communal lament. There are certain psalms that are called royal psalms. Some focus on God the Lord as king, some focus on an earthly king. There are some psalms which are clearly processional psalms for very formal occasions. There are wedding psalms. There's a set of 7 penitential psalms. And of course, of special interest for our purposes, the wisdom psalms. While scholars have proposed various ways to classify, the ways to group these things in order to understand the Psalter better, I would like to propose to you a project. It's one that I've done myself. I've often recommended it to others, and it can make the whole book of the Psalms so much more our own possession. After you have finished reading a psalm or praying a psalm, I would suggest that what you do is take a moment and ask yourself, what type of psalm do you find it to be? That is, rather than using somebody else's categories, you can generate your own categories, your own classification system. And doing it in this way, it may well help to identify for you certain psalms that you want to come back to. They're particularly helpful for meditation or for thinking through a problem or for praying. Making lists like this will help you find your way back to these things a little more easily. The Psalms were meant to be sung. There is much evidence that the Psalms that are collected together in the book of Psalms were intended. There were certain kinds of chant that were used and often accompanied by instrumental music. In both modern Jewish and modern Christian liturgical use of the Psalms, there are many beautiful settings. Some of them are quite haunting. This happens, of course, by the way in which the music accompanying the words, as well as the words, bring out the emotional and the spiritual nature of the prayer that is being sung. On the other hand, for those of you who are not particularly musically inclined, no need to worry. They provide wonderful structures for meditation or for prayer when they are recited aloud or recited silently, when you are alone or when in groups. Matter of fact, we do not know the original musical settings for the Psalms. There are only occasional hints that remain in the text. Occasionally, for instance, one finds in the opening words something that may have to do with the specific musical setting. It's also possible that those phrases that you'll find near the beginning of a psalm in your printed editions, they may simply be designating a particular collection to which the psalms belong. For example, we find labels on some of them that are of David. 11 of them have the term of Asaph, 8 of them of Korah. Whether these inscriptions are meant to indicate authorship or melody or something else, we simply do not know for sure. I should mention that various editions and translations of the Bible handle these inscriptions at the beginning of many of the Psalms differently when they're numbering the verses. And hence the numbering that you'll find, for instance, in the handbook that accompanies this course, they may be off by one in comparison with the Bible you use, and that's often because of the case of this initial inscription. With the question of numbering still in mind, there is another problem that we need to mention here at the start of our study, beside the problem simply of verse numbering, and that's the problem of the psalm numbering, that is, the numbering of the psalms themselves. The main difference begins with determining where the 10th psalm begins. What I mean is that the standard Hebrew text calls Psalm 10 what the Latin version of this, that was the Vulgate, regards as the second half of Psalm 9. So because of that difference in the numbering, everything thereafter is off by one. The numbering of the Vulgate and all the subsequent versions that are in that tradition, they run one number behind the number that is used in the Hebrew text. The Hebrew text then joins together what the Vulgate divides into Psalms 114 and 115. And if that weren't complicated enough, the Hebrew text then divides what the Vulgate regards as Psalm 116, and the numbering only synchronizes again when the Hebrew text treats as a single psalm what the Vulgate lists as Psalm 146 and 147. The result is 150 psalms, however you get there. For the many cases in which there are two possible numbers, the convention that I'll be following here, both in what I say as well as in the printed book, is to put the Hebrew number first, followed by the Vulgate number. So for instance, if I said Psalm 139, I'm referring to the Hebrew numbering, and the Vulgate numbering is 138. And in the printed text, I simply put the Vulgate numbering in brackets behind the numbering that's from the Hebrew text. Let's look now at the structure of the book of Psalms, because it does have an interesting structure. The 150 psalms that make up the book that's called the Psalter are grouped in five collections of unequal length, apparently designed to match the 5 books of the Pentateuch. The first collection, it's Psalms 1 to 41, or if you're using that Vulgate number, 40, but I won't keep saying that. This is an early collection of Davidic hymns. They're called Davidic because of the inscription of David that is at the head of many of them, beginning with Psalm 3. They are thought to be relatively early, and the reasoning here is because of the use of a special term for God that they use, namely, when the Tetragrammaton, or the famous 4-letter name, YHWH, that was given to Moses by God on Mount Sinai, sometimes this will be transliterated in English as YHWH, and some translations fill in those vowels. But the Jewish practice that is reflected in this Davidic tradition was to substitute a different word. Because that name YHWH is so sacred, we substitute something else. That is, the Hebrew reading of this substituted the word Adonai out of respect for the sacredness of God's gift when he disclosed his name. In doing so, these psalms can be dated as probably coming from the same period. They use that Adonai tradition. We will say it in this course by saying the Lord. A second collection is Psalms 42 to 72. This is a northern collection of hymns. Scholars regard this collection as from the northern 10 tribes, that is, the tribes of Israel, because they use a different word. Instead of saying Adonai to replace the Tetragrammaton, they use an entirely different word in the printed text. It's the word Elohim, as tended to be the case in the other works that we know that originated among those northern tribes. Now, here too, there's a matter of great interest. The word Elohim is not a singular word. It's a word that's plural in its grammatical form. The singular would be El, the plural is Elohim. And yet, when this word Elohim occurs, it takes a singular verb. To illustrate the point, consider a line that is likely to be more familiar to us all than virtually any other line from the Bible. The first line of Genesis. It too uses the word Elohim, and if I were translating it very literally, what I would say is, in the beginning, God has created the heavens and the earth. Admittedly, that's not good English. It's a plural subject, gods, but a singular verb, has created. when we're trying to render this in better English, what we would say is, in the beginning, God created, and so on and so forth. The religion of Israel was radically monotheist and insisted at all costs on the point that there is only one God. And yet, the generic word for divinity turns out to be this plural word, Elohim. Some scholars see here an anachronism, something that's hearkening back to the polytheistic culture into which God revealed himself. Some Christians look forward here, see a mysterious reference to the Trinity, the doctrine of one God in three persons. Without trying to resolve that problem here, I would simply like to note that this set of Psalms uses this word for God, Elohim, even when it includes the very same psalm as the previous set. For instance, Psalm 14 and Psalm 53 from these two sets, they have virtually the same opening stanza. But then, as a way to illustrate the difference here in the terminology about the divine verses, we could take a look beginning at verse 5. For just this one case, I'm going to use the Jerusalem Bible rather than the translation I'll use elsewhere for the Psalms, simply because of the way it makes this difference so pointedly clear. One can also see in what I'm going to say how the Jerusalem Bible does not use the practice of substituting the term Lord in small caps for the Tetragrammaton, but rather adopts one of the many ways that you can handle it. Here it adopts the ways of spelling out the letters Y, H, W, H, and doing so with putting the vowels in. Let me read the two texts. Yahweh is looking down from heaven at the sons of men. That's from Psalm 14. In Psalm 53, God is looking down from heaven at the sons of men. One can go through the rest of the psalm in a similar way. My point is simply to suggest there's a reason for thinking that the first 40 have come from the Davidic source, that the next set comes from a different source in the northern kingdom. One can see the same sort of difference throughout Psalm 70 when you compare it to Psalm 40, whose last part it virtually matches, except in the word that is used for God. Presumably, we have, in cases like these, a psalm that was used in both the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, with this difference in the preferred term for God. The third group begins at Psalm 73 and goes through Psalm 89. This is a collection that seems to be especially designed for use in the temple, with a considerably greater number of instructions for the singers. That is, when you've got a very formal setting, you better have clear directions. The fourth group, Psalms 90 to 106, are psalms from a royal collection. They are often used for the celebration of the Jewish feast that occurs in the fall, the feast of Rosh Hashanah or New Year, as well as for the feast of Booths. Psalms 93 and 99 through 99, Psalms 93 and then Psalms 95 through 99 are designed to honor the Lord's kingship. And then Psalms 105 and 106 recount God's great deeds in the history of salvation. The fifth group is from Psalms 107 to the end, Psalms 150. This appears to be a second collection of Davidic royal psalms, and this is the part that includes the pilgrimage psalms, describing how the people go up to the temple in their worship. The final verse of each collection is an interesting aspect too. So when you're reading through the book of Psalms, the psalm that ends the collection has a summation. Each of these collections is marked by a kind of special prayer and a blessing of praise for God that serves as the last verse. Again, let me give an example of that comes from Psalm 41 in the Hebrew text numbering. Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, from age to age. Amen, amen. That same kind of verse of praise will be found at the end of the next collection, at the end of Psalm 72. It will be found at the end of the third collection, at the end of Psalm 89, and found at the end of Psalm 106 to end the fourth collection. It's sort of a transitional verse. Let me turn, though, to a different topic, namely the use of these psalms in prayer. I'll begin with a discussion of the way in which They were used in ancient Judaism. I mentioned earlier that nowadays the Psalms are clearly used for both personal prayer and in liturgical settings. And we could ask, was that true also in ancient Judaism? There is every reason to think that the Psalms were used both for personal and for liturgical prayer then as well. Even for the Psalms whose context seems deeply personal, and there are some Psalms like that, it seems to scholars very likely that the institution associated with the temple had a tremendous amount to do with saving even these personal prayers and gathering them into the collections that we now have, even though they probably didn't have such a liturgical use. On the other hand, some of the Psalms appear very directly connected to specific liturgical services. The reciting of the Hallel Psalms, for instance. Hallel is the Hebrew version. We probably know it more often in English as Alleluia. That's the collection from Psalm number 111 through Psalm 118. These psalms were recited by the Levites during the time when the lambs were being slaughtered for the Feast of Passover. It's a very obvious liturgical function. Another aspect of the question about the prayer, the use of the Psalms for prayer, is matching up the type of prayer with the type of psalm. One of the books that I've learned an awful lot from is a book called To Pray as a Jew, a guide to the prayer book and the synagogue service. The author, Rabbi Chaim Halevi Donin, notes that there are 4 main purposes for our praying: petition, thanksgiving, praise of God, and something self-searching or confessional. He explains in some detail how the Psalms and other written prayer texts help a person to express various thoughts, various feelings, as well as teach us something about what to ask for and how to act if we want to be consistent with what we're praying and desiring. I think this is generally true for Christianity also. In my own tradition as a Catholic Christian, I would note that a book like the Catechism of the Catholic Church expresses the same idea, but uses slightly different words when it's distinguishing. First, blessing and adoration, petition for forgiveness, intercession, and finally, thanksgiving and praise. Again, the same basic purposes, maybe a different set of words for understanding how to classify those purposes. It seems to me that there is a real common sense here about the appropriateness of efforts to match the type of psalm to the type of praying that we might want to do. Let's consider further then this topic of praying the wisdom psalms by looking at the psalms that are given this particular classification. There is fairly wide, but of course among scholars nothing is ever quite unanimous, there is a fairly wide agreement among scholars on the list of wisdom psalms. It's a group that includes the very first psalm, and then number 8, number 19, number 36, 37, 49, 73, 78, 112, 119, 127, 128, and then Psalm 139, very special to me personally. The other groupings of psalms have as their main functions to give praise or thanksgiving, perhaps to give voice to an individual or a communal when there is need to lament and to mourn, to celebrate the kingship of God or some earthly king, to serve some liturgical function like a wedding or a procession, and sometimes to recount the great deeds that God has done within the history of salvation. The wisdom psalms, like the Bible's sapiential books in general, tend to focus on the divine source of wisdom and on our human need for wisdom. Sometimes they put in their prayers ways that remind us of what we should think, what we should believe, how we should act. There'll be more to say on this in future lectures when we turn to the Psalms, but for the moment, in this lecture, I'd like to just to focus for a while on one example and do it in greater length, namely Psalm 1. Like the book of Proverbs that we have been studying, this psalm makes a very strong contrast between virtue and vice. Just as in the book of Proverbs, we saw Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly, and not only in the personified figures of those two women, but also in the contrasting proverbs that they suggested. Well, this psalm, too, has a contrast between virtue and vice, and equally, a very strong connection between wisdom and Torah. It also provides an exhortation to us, like the book of Proverbs was regularly exhorting us, an exhortation to undertake virtue, for it is virtue that will bring prosperity. The psalm warns us of vice, which will bring disaster, just as the book of Proverbs warns us of that kind of disaster that's likely to come. In praying it, what we do is to join our voices and our minds, perhaps in music, to the words and thoughts that the Scriptures present to us as having a kind of divine approval or divine sanction. Here's the psalm in the New King James Version, and what I'd like to do is just to read it through first and then to comment on some of the details that are within it. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the path of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. He shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that brings forth its fruit in its season, whose leaf also shall not wither, and whatever he does shall prosper. The ungodly are not so, but are like the chaff which the wind drives away. Therefore the ungodly shall not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. What I'd like to do now is just to reflect on the individual lines that are there and to consider some of the great points of significance of the way in which the Psalms have expressed themselves. To go back to the very beginning line, which reads, "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly." There are other translations of this. For example, the Grail translation translates that opening line, that opening word, as happy. The New King James Version, like many an older translation, renders it as blessed. Again, Christians may well be inclined to hear, in this point, an anticipation of the Beatitudes. Blessed is this and blessed is that. I think that there is quite good reason for using the term blessed here, since this is not just some ordinary kind of happiness, but is the sort of happiness that comes from truly being blessed by God. We also see in that first stanza, namely, blessed the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the path of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful. We see that strong contrast here between the way of life that Lady Wisdom had so much recommended to us in the book of Proverbs, and the way of death that is brought by Lady Folly. The man here who is described as blessed, his fortunes are suggested that they will be otherwise. His delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. We see in that section a very strong indication of how one is to get this wisdom. And the immediate implication is that one gets this wisdom by meditating on Torah. One meditates on the law of the Lord that God had communicated. This is the way in which the Proverbs and the sapiential literature regularly treat the idea of covenant and the central section of covenant that comes with the Decalogue, with its directives for human life and its great good sense about what it is that we humans must do in order to please God and to live a life in society living according to the commandments that is likely to bring the kind of happiness and the kind of prosperity that God intends for us. When we turn to verse 5, we get an image that will often recur in biblical wisdom literature. The image in verse 5 is of a tree beside the flowing stream, and scholars have often connected the image of this first psalm and the image as it occurs in wisdom literature with the story about the Garden of Eden in Genesis. that if only the first parents, if only Adam and Eve had confined themselves to eating from the tree of life, they would indeed have honored God's will, they would have followed his directives and suggestions, and would thereby have enjoyed the fruits that would come from honoring God's will. For them, symbolically, it would have been a life that was without end and was not subject to death. But very immediately, the Jewish tradition of interpretation and the Christian interpretation of the Psalms with it suggests that this is done by way of analogy for our moral life and for the way in which we are intended to be faithful to God and to eat only of this fruit and not rather of the sad fruit that brought about the eviction of Adam and Eve from the garden. In the final stanza, we hear a little bit about the way in which the way of the wicked proceeds. It says, "The ungodly are not so, but are like the chaff which the wind drives away. The ungodly shall not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous." I mean, it's fascinating to me to hear in the lines of this first psalm the way in which we're thinking of the congregation, the way in which we're thinking of the assembly of the people, so that this is something that is not only personal, but also has a communal dimension to it. And the recitation of this psalm, I think, is designed not only to have the individual reflect upon a personal situation, but to have the community together to recite this. It is part of the way in which the Psalms also have a didactic function, and one sometimes sees these wisdom psalms regarded as the didactic part of the Psalter, the part of the Psalter that is aimed at teaching these moral lessons like biblical wisdom literature regularly teaches it. This prayer in the Psalms is then a reminder of where to find wisdom. It is simple and straightforward. It is without the complications of the problem of innocent suffering, to which we'll turn in our next set of lectures on Job, and after that turn to a wisdom psalm that reflects those concerns. But what I'd like to suggest to us is that we ponder these psalms, perhaps that you undertake the exercise that I was describing of starting to classify them, and to ask yourself some of the questions. One question that I like to ask myself, especially in the communal recitation of the Psalms, which we do, for instance, just as priests or as members of a praying community, what do you do about the situations in which what we're praying together communally doesn't quite correspond with the content of the psalm? On Fridays, for instance, it's our custom to pray the penitential psalms, and would that I felt penitential all the time or at those times, but sometimes that's not particularly the mood in which I'm in. What I find is that the psalms help to set the mood, and even if the mood doesn't change, even if the emotion isn't particularly there, I think that there's a great value for using the psalms to meditate, even when I'm not yet quite in the position of being ready to say them as my own prayer. That part of what the life of devotion consists in is the meditation, the thinking, the chewing on a text, the readiness to say it and to reflect, at least to reflect as long as communal recitation will allow, and then perhaps to ask myself some of the questions that the psalm suggests. At least I find, in my own experience, is that sometimes this leads to the kind of prayer that I'm called upon to be doing. I hope that will be useful in your consideration. We'll turn in our next lecture, however, to the book of Job and back to the problem of suffering.